He fired her for being 5 minutes late. Days later, he found her nearly frozen to death on a bench outside his office, still wearing the uniform she once cleaned his mansion in. What happened next shocked the entire city, and changed everything. The snow fell like a silent judgment over the city, wrapping its streets in a thick, indifferent hush. It was the kind of night where even the neon lights seemed to dim in mourning. In the heart of the financial district, a single figure sat slumped on a rusted park bench, nearly invisible beneath the frost gathering on her navy blue uniform. Her name was Eliza. To most, she was nobody. To Benedict Hayes, the billionaire tycoon whose name adorned half the city's skyline, she was just the maid, a shadow who appeared at 6 and vanished before anyone noticed. For the past 4 years, Eliza had scrubbed his marble floors, polished his silver, and made sure the fire in the library crackled before Benedict returned from his empire-building days. He never asked where she came from or where she went at night. He didn't need to. That wasn't part of the contract. But Eliza had been living in the broom closet behind the servants' quarters ever since her husband died in a factory fire and the hospital bills swallowed her entire savings. She'd sent every paycheck to her daughter's tuition and her father's dialysis. She was proud. She never asked for help. And when Benedict fired her for being 5 minutes late, after she slipped on icy steps trying to catch the bus, she said nothing. Just bowed slightly, eyes cast down, and walked into the bitter cold with nothing but the clothes on her back. That was 3 nights ago. Now, her breath was shallow, her fingers blue, her body curled up like a discarded doll. Benedict wasn't supposed to be walking that night. His chauffeur had called in sick, and the limo service had botched the backup. He cursed under his breath and cut through the park, Armani shoes crunching the snow. That's when he saw the figure. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. Then he saw the familiar apron. The hands. The silence. He froze. The world spun. For a man who had conquered markets and silenced boardrooms, this was different. This wasn't a failure of strategy. This was a failure of attention. Eliza, he called, unsure why his voice cracked. She didn't move. The wind howled. And in that moment, Benedict Hayes realized for the first time in his life, he hadn't just overlooked someone. He had erased her. Benedict Hayes dropped to his knees in the snow without thinking, his $1,000 coat absorbing the wetness as if punishment were necessary. The woman before him didn't flinch, didn't stir. Her lashes were rimmed with frost, her lips slightly parted, her breath barely there. For the first time, he noticed how small she looked, how thin her coat was, how her name tag was still pinned with desperate pride to her chest. Eliza, he said again, louder now, his voice shaking. Still nothing. He reached for her shoulder, felt the icy stiffness beneath the uniform fabric, and panic surged up through his throat like fire. Not the panic of a missed meeting or a tanking stock, but something ancient, primal, a man faced with the consequences of his own blindness. He fumbled for his phone with frozen fingers, dialing emergency services while his mind screamed at him for letting this happen. She had worked for him. She had served him with quiet diligence for years, and he hadn't even known her last name. The operator's voice crackled through the receiver, asking questions, giving instructions, but Benedict barely heard them. All he could see was Eliza, this woman who had moved like a ghost through his world, now lying on a park bench like a forgotten page torn from a book no one cared to finish. As he waited for the ambulance, time slowed. The snow kept falling. He brushed it from her shoulders gently, as if ashamed to touch her too late. He remembered her hands, steady, graceful, always wiping counters or folding his shirts with an elegance no one noticed. He remembered how she smiled once when the first crocuses bloomed outside the kitchen window. But he couldn't remember if he'd ever said good morning. He couldn't remember if he'd ever asked her how she was. The guilt gripped him like a vice. This wasn't charity. This wasn't pity. This was revelation. The ambulance lights cut through the white haze moments later, and he flagged them down like a man chasing redemption. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, he followed, not as a billionaire, not as a boss, but as a man suddenly aware of how monstrous indifference can be. The paramedics didn't recognize him, and he didn't care. He sat beside her in the van, gripping her hand that barely gripped back, whispering over and over again, "I'm sorry. I didn't see you. But I do now." The fluorescent lights of the emergency room flickered overhead, cold and sterile, a harsh contrast to the warmth that had begun to thaw somewhere deep in Benedict Hayes' chest. Eliza lay motionless beneath layers of thermal blankets, full lines snaking from her arms, a nasal cannula delivering slow streams of oxygen. The doctor's words had been firm: severe hypothermia, dangerously low core temperature, possible frostbite, organ strain. Another hour outside and she wouldn't have made it. Benedict sat beside her, motionless, his expensive clothes soaked and clinging to his skin. He had silenced entire boardrooms with a glance, brought governments to negotiation tables with a phone call, but tonight, he had no power. Not here. Not with her. Not with the truth that echoed louder than any stock ticker ever could. He had failed her. The room buzzed with machines and hushed voices, but his world had gone quiet, narrowed to the shallow rise and fall of Eliza's chest. Her presence was barely there, but it anchored him. He didn't look at his phone, though it vibrated endlessly, assistants calling, reporters probing, shareholders demanding answers about why the CEO of Hayes Holdings had disappeared. He didn't care. For the first time in years, Benedict Hayes wasn't thinking in numbers or deals. He was thinking in moments. Missed ones. Forgotten ones. Ones that could never be fixed. He watched the condensation gather on the inside of her oxygen mask and realized it was the first time he'd truly seen her breathe. And that hit him like a hammer. How many times had she opened the curtains while he drank coffee? How many nights had she stayed late, sweeping floors long after the others had left? And how many of those nights had she slept just a few rooms away, hidden in a storage closet, surrounded by cleaning supplies while he slept under cashmere sheets? The weight of it crushed him. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, hands clasped, jaw tight. "I fired you without a question," he whispered. "I treated you like you didn't exist." Eliza didn't stir. The machines continued their quiet rhythm. "I don't want forgiveness," he said, "I want to change." Outside, snow melted beneath morning sun, but inside, something colder had started to break, his pride. And somewhere in that sterile room, the most powerful man in the city sat broken, not by loss, but by finally understanding what his wealth had blinded him to all along. The hospital staff had begun to notice him by now, not because of who he was, but because he wouldn't leave. For 2 days and nights, Benedict Hayes remained in that chair beside Eliza's bed, barely moving, barely speaking. Nurses whispered in corners, some with curiosity, others with confusion, trying to reconcile the man from magazine covers with the one quietly holding a maid's hand as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the ground. But Benedict didn't care how they saw him. His mind was elsewhere, running back through years of silence, calculating not profits but the cost of looking away. On the morning of the third day, Eliza stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, her lips cracked as she tried to speak, and Benedict leaned forward, eyes wide, breath held. She whispered, "Am I still alive?" The words were soft, unsure, like a child waking from a bad dream. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes. You're safe now." Her eyes adjusted slowly, focusing on him. There was no joy in her gaze, only confusion. "Why are you here?" she asked, voice hoarse. He looked at her, stunned by the weight of that question. Why was he here? Because he should have been long before. Because he had failed her in ways that couldn't be undone by money or apology. "Because I didn't know how blind I was," he said quietly. She turned her head to the wall, tears slipping from her eyes. "I was never late before. I never stole. I did my job." He nodded, eyes stinging. "And I never asked why. That's my shame, not yours." She didn't speak after that, and he didn't push her. But he stayed. When the doctor came in with updates, Benedict asked every question, took every note. When Eliza's medication needed authorization, he signed without flinching. When the bill was presented, he paid it in full without looking at the numbers. And when she fell asleep again, he sat quietly and stared at the floor, overwhelmed by the simplicity of the truth. This wasn't about saving face or making a statement. This was about seeing someone he had never really seen before. And from that moment, Benedict made himself a promise. If she woke again, if she ever gave him the chance, he would never let her fall through the cracks again. Not her. Not anyone like her. Never again. Benedict Hayes returned home the next morning, not to rest but to act. His mansion, once a symbol of perfection and control, now felt hollow, like a monument to all the things he had ignored. He walked through the halls with new eyes, pausing in rooms he had never cared to notice before. The staff avoided his gaze, assuming he had come back with anger or demands, but instead, he called everyone to the main hall. Cooks, drivers, cleaners, gardeners, they gathered with hesitant glances, unsure of what storm was about to unfold. Benedict stood at the foot of the marble staircase, no suit jacket, no polished speech, just a man with something real to say. 3 days ago, I fired someone without understanding her story, he began. And it nearly cost her life. The room fell silent. No one moved. A few exchanged glances, one woman pressed a tissue to her mouth. Her name is Eliza, he continued, and she was more than just a maid. She was a daughter, a mother, a widow. She was sleeping in this house while we all went to bed. She was starving while we dined. And I never saw her. Not really. That's on me. He paused, letting the words sink in. I've built skyscrapers, made millions, controlled markets. But I couldn't see the suffering of someone in the room with me every day. That is not power. That is failure. No one had ever heard him speak this way. Some of the older staff blinked in disbelief. Others looked down, ashamed that they, too, had never asked Eliza if she was okay. Then, in a moment that would become legend among them, Benedict Hayes said something no one had ever imagined. I'm sorry. 2 words. Quiet. But they shook the room. Not because of volume, but because of who said them. The man known for silence had chosen truth. We're going to change things, he said. Not just for Eliza, but for everyone. No more pretending people are invisible. No more walking past pain. I don't want this house to be built on silence anymore. And with that, he turned and walked away, not needing applause or validation. Word spread fast. And when the photo of Eliza asleep on the bench, taken by a jogger unaware of who she was, went viral, the story ignited something deeper than outrage. It sparked accountability. And Benedict wasn't running from it. He was walking straight through it. The photograph made its way across the internet like wildfire, a single frozen frame of a woman in a navy blue uniform curled on a park bench beneath a sheet of snow. No one knew her name at first, but her stillness, the way the frost clung to her clothes, the quiet tragedy of her posture, it haunted people. Social media exploded with outrage, influencers reposted it with captions about inequality, news anchors speculated about who she might be, and within hours the world knew. The woman was Eliza, and she had worked for Benedict Hayes. The billionaire who had built tech empires and luxury towers had, for years, passed by a woman collapsing under the weight of sacrifice and silence. Journalists camped outside the hospital, helicopters buzzed overhead, hashtags trended worldwide. But Benedict made no public comment. He didn't draft a statement. He didn't call his PR team. He simply remained by Eliza's side. When asked by a nurse if he would be issuing a press release, he looked up and said quietly, I have more to do than talk. And he meant it. That afternoon, Eliza opened her eyes again, stronger this time. Her fingers flexed, her lips no longer cracked. She saw Benedict there, his sleeves rolled, his eyes tired, and asked, You stayed? He nodded. I'm not leaving again. She studied him, searching for pretense. But something had changed in him. His gaze was no longer one of a man looking down. It was someone trying to look inward. I can't go back to your house, she said. Not after, he shook his head. You're not going back to work. You're going to rest. Heal. And then, we'll talk about what you want to do next. Not what I expect. What you deserve. She hesitated, pride flaring, fear whispering warnings of pity disguised as help. This isn't charity, he said gently. It's a correction. That night, when Eliza was discharged, a black town car waited outside, not to return her to labor, but to deliver her to safety. Benedict stood beside it, holding a coat and scarf. Not as gifts, but as armor. For the first time in months, Eliza entered a warm space that wasn't hers to clean. And though her body was weak, something stronger had begun to stir inside her. Not just survival, but a return to dignity. And Benedict, once blind, now saw it in full color. The guest wing of Benedict Hayes's estate had never been used. It was more of a concept than a necessity, a space designed for the idea of visitors that never truly came. Now it housed a woman who had once cleaned its chandeliers. Eliza walked slowly through the halls, guided by the soft voice of a private nurse and the warmth of a robe she hadn't paid for. The air smelled of jasmine and wood polish, but for the first time, she wasn't here to clean it. She was here to breathe. To sleep. To heal. Her room had tall windows that caught the morning sun, a bed so soft she feared it would swallow her whole, and a tray of tea that arrived without request. At first, she didn't trust it. Years of hardship had conditioned her to flinch at ease, to brace for the cost hidden behind comfort. But no demands came. No strings. Just quiet. And each evening, Benedict knocked, softly, humbly, and sat across from her with tea of his own. At first, they said little. Then, slowly, stories began to fill the silence. She told him about growing up in a Louisiana town where buses ran twice a day and dreams cost more than groceries. She spoke of her late husband, a machinist who once called her laugh a lucky charm. She described the nights she folded Benedict's laundry by hand, hiding in the broom closet afterward to avoid being seen when staff left. Benedict listened, not with the intention to reply, but to understand. And the more he heard, the more he realized how much of her life had existed in plain sight, just outside the boundaries of his attention. She asked about his daughter, his mother, the things money never fixed. He answered with less polish each night, shedding layers of performance he had once mistaken for strength. Eliza began to eat again. Her hands steadied. Her cheeks regained color. A letter arrived from the hospital, an apology from the administration for turning her away weeks ago when she sought warmth but had no ID. Benedict read it and quietly shredded it. "They failed you," he said. "They don't get to excuse it with paper." Eliza nodded, but something in her eyes had changed. It was the look of a woman remembering who she had been before life pushed her down. And Benedict saw it clearly. She wasn't rebuilding. She was rising. It was a rainy afternoon when Benedict made his decision. The storm tapped against the glass of his office like a reminder, one he could no longer ignore. He stood by the window, watching the clouds drift low over the city he'd once ruled with ruthless efficiency, but this time he wasn't thinking about numbers or quarterly targets. He was thinking about people. One person, specifically. Eliza. The woman who had walked his halls unnoticed for years, who had served with grace while suffering in silence. Her recovery had become more than a personal mission. It had become a mirror. And what he saw in it shamed him. For the first time, Benedict drafted something by hand, not typed by assistants or ghostwritten for headlines. He wrote a proposal, simple, clear, and placed it in a folder marked only with her name. That evening, as the storm calmed and golden light returned to the guest wing, he knocked once again. Eliza opened the door, stronger now, a robe cinched at the waist, her hair braided neatly. She looked like herself again, and yet like someone entirely new. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Benedict began. "I've created a new role in the company. One that never existed before. Director of Staff and Employee Welfare. It comes with a team, a budget, full benefits, and full authority." Eliza blinked. "To do what?" He handed her the folder. "To make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else under my roof. To notice what I never did. To catch the ones who fall through the cracks." She opened it slowly, eyes scanning the pages. "This is important," she said, softly. "You trust me with this?" Benedict met her gaze without hesitation. "I've never trusted anyone more." Her hands trembled slightly as she closed the folder. "And if I say no?" He nodded. "Then I'll still thank you for teaching me what real leadership looks like. But I hope you'll say yes. Not for me. For every Eliza no one ever sees." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the window, watching raindrops trace slow paths down the glass. And in the quiet, a decision formed, not out of obligation, but out of power. Her power. When she turned back, her voice was steady. "I'll take it. But I do it my way." Benedict smiled. "That's the only way I want it." The transformation began quietly. Eliza didn't enter her new role with fireworks or speeches. She arrived at Hayes Holdings headquarters one Monday morning in a navy blue blazer and soft-soled shoes, carrying nothing but a leather notebook and the weight of everything she had survived. Most of the staff didn't recognize her at first, though a few gasped when they realized who she was. The photo of her on that bench had become iconic, used in articles, awareness campaigns, even murals. But standing in the lobby now, she looked like a woman in command. Benedict greeted her at the entrance, not with grandeur, but with respect. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded once. "Been ready." Her office was bright and modest, overlooking the city streets she had once wandered in desperation. From her desk, she could see the hospital that had nearly turned her away, the park bench where her breath nearly ended, and the rooftop of the mansion where she had once folded laundry alone. But she wasn't looking backward. She was building forward. Within weeks, she had implemented quiet reforms across every Hayes property. Mandatory wellness checks for all hourly staff. Anonymous reporting systems. Emergency housing stipends. A hotline for mental health and financial crises. Each policy was designed not by committee, but by memory, hers. And the impact was immediate. Staff who had once walked with lowered eyes now stood a little taller. Managers who had once focused on output now asked questions like, "How are you?" It wasn't perfect. Change never is. But something had shifted. Benedict watched it all unfold like a man seeing color for the first time. He attended staff briefings not as a figurehead but as a student. He listened, he took notes, and for the first time, his empire felt human. One afternoon, while walking through the employee cafeteria, Benedict overheard a janitor say, she's the reason I stayed. I was ready to quit. Then I met Eliza. He didn't interrupt. He just smiled to himself and kept walking. Later that evening, he returned to the guest wing, where Eliza still stayed by choice, and found her sipping tea by the window. I think they love you, he said. I don't need love, she replied. I need them to be safe. He nodded. And they are. Because of you. And in that moment, he knew he hadn't just given her a title. He'd handed her a torch. And she had set the whole system on fire. With grace, the ballroom gleamed under a canopy of golden lights, crystal chandeliers swaying gently above a sea of polished shoes and whispered conversations. It was the annual Hayes Foundation Gala, an event once known for flaunting wealth, prestige, and exclusivity. But this year, something was different. The guest list had changed. Among the tailored suits and glittering gowns stood janitors, housekeepers, interns, single mothers, and night shift workers. The invitation read, "If this city stands because of you, you belong in this room." At the head of the event stood Benedict Hayes, no longer just a name on headlines, but a man redefined. He took the stage quietly, waited for the room to settle, then spoke not like a CEO, but like someone who had finally learned what it meant to be part of a world rather than above it. "For years," he began, "I built buildings and believed I was building legacy. But legacy is not made of glass and steel. It's made of the lives we lift when we choose to see what we've ignored." He paused, the room silent. "Tonight, I want to introduce you to the person who taught me that. The person who showed me that dignity doesn't come from power, it comes from perseverance." He extended a hand toward the edge of the stage. And from the crowd stepped Eliza. She wore a simple navy blue dress, her hair braided neatly, a silver pin on her lapel that read, "Director of Human Care." As she ascended the steps, the crowd rose to their feet, not out of politeness, not out of pity, but out of awe. Eliza stood before them, not as the maid they never noticed, but as the architect of change, the quiet force who had turned one man's guilt into a revolution of empathy. She didn't say much. Just this, "I was invisible once. Now I see others like I used to be. And we are many. But not silent anymore." Applause filled the hall like thunder. Cameras flashed. But in the corner of the room, Benedict watched with his hands clasped, eyes shining not from pride, but from humility. He hadn't saved her. She had saved herself. He had only, finally, looked up. And in doing so, he had changed more than a company. He had changed the way power listened. And from that night on, her story was no longer his shame. It was everyone's reminder that kindness is not a footnote. It's the beginning.